Hi, I'm Aaron from Complyify, and this is an overview of the Data Room Assessment Evidence Review stage in Complyify. In this example, we've started a PCI review already, and we're logged in as an assessor named Bob Porter. The scope has already been approved and agreed upon by the assessor and the user, and we're now in the evidence review stage of the assessment. To begin, we'll click More Detail. Here in the Assessment Detail view, as an assessor, we can see that every scope has been submitted by the user and approved by us, the assessor. At this point, we can begin asking for new evidence by either going to the Documentation or Controls tab. Sampling will be a tab we will address later. When we go to the Documentation tab, we can begin to add requests for new documentation. We choose documentation first by type, choosing from types that are already in Complyify, and then adding which controls this request applies to. These will be controls that are required to have this documentation in order to pass their portion of the assessment. We can add multiple different requests for documentation. In this case, we're going to ask for a cardholder data diagram and a firewall configuration standards document. The first applies to 3 controls, the second only applies to 1. The user will then be able to upload a single document that will satisfy all 3 controls. But at this point, no documentation has been added. An assessor could add a comment if they chose to add further detail to what is required. In the Controls tab, we can add more types of evidence requests in addition to the documentation. Here we see the firewall request on A11, and in R110, we see that the cardholder data diagram was requested. The request column will only show pending requests, things that have been submitted by the user that need approval as an assessor. The user currently has open request under this column. Let's open a couple of different kinds of requests in addition to the documentation. We have the option to add attestations, screenshots, or comments to each control to ask for further detail. We choose here an attestation and choose from current attestations that are applicable to this control. We can apply it to other controls in addition to the one we're currently viewing and submit. We can add other types of evidence requests in the same manner by choosing evidence request, and in this case, choosing a screenshot for a user to upload. We can choose a description of what the screenshot should entail, add any additional controls if necessary, and submit, or add a comment. Ask a user to make any kind of comment. This will only come from the administrator who has access to the assessment, and submit that as well. At this point, the user will have different requests open of different types that they'll be able to see in their view. They can see it in the controls view here, or documentation requests that have not yet given an answer. In this case, we can upload a cardholder data diagram by choosing Attach Documentation and choosing a cardholder data diagram that was already uploaded by a user earlier in Complyify, and submit. In the case of the firewall configuration standard document, when we go to Attach Documentation, a firewall document has not yet been added. So we can click the Go to Governance button, which will take us to the Governance page of Complyify. Here, we can choose a standard and upload a firewall configuration standard required by the assessor. I'll attach documentation and upload it. When I return to the assessment, I will now have access to that configuration standard because of its type. So when I choose Attach Documentation, I'll find the firewall configuration standard there and can upload it and submit it to the assessor. At this point, under the Controls tab, the top controls that require documentation are already satisfied. The ones I have left are the attestations, screenshots, and comments that the assessor has added. On the attestation, I can choose Add Attestation and see any observations that have been made by other users. In this case, Bill Lumberg already answered this question earlier. I can simply attach his answer and share it with the assessor by clicking the Submit button. For a screenshot evidence request, I can click the Add Screenshot button, which will allow me to upload a local file, like a screenshot, to Complyify. Once submitted, the assessor will have access to be able to download that file to approve this screenshot request. Even after evidence has been submitted to the assessor, a comment can be added to add extra context for the assessor to understand when reviewing the specific evidence request. This can apply to any evidence type. For a comment, all the assessor is asking for is for the admin who's actively working the assessment to provide some kind of detail or answer some kind of question. A comment can be added and submitted to the assessor, and sometimes a back and forth might happen before it's approved. Once it's submitted, the assessor will have access to it. At this point, we're logging in as an assessor who can review all the evidence requests after they've been submitted by the user. A documentation request can be downloaded and reviewed. If it meets the requirements, the assessor can approve it. For the other documentation, let's say after they download the document, they find an exception to it. They can add an exception, note it to the assessment, and submit that. The documentation request is now complete, but with a noted exception. This is distinct from an assessor reopening a request and asking the user to make a new answer. For an attestation request, an assessor would review the observation that's been made, can see the answer that was made, the person that made it, and the time, and can approve, reopen, add an exception, or add comments. For screenshots, they can, of course, download the screenshot and review it offline, and they can review comments made by the user to add extra context. All requests have these basic actions that the assessor can take: approving, reopening, adding exception, or commenting on any given control. This pattern would continue for each control until the assessor is satisfied that all controls have been met. At this point, moving on to the sampling stage of the assessment, which will be covered in the next video.